Hey, I want to talk for a few moments from the topic sorry, not sorry. Sorry, not sorry. And I'll be using as a text Luke, the 23rd chapter, verses 32 through 34, where it says, two other also who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And they came to the place that is called the skull. They crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And they cast lots to divide his clothing. I grew up as the middle child in my family. I had an older sister, 3 years older than me, and I have a younger brother. He's 6 years younger than me. And when I was young, we moved around a lot since my father was an itinerant minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And since we moved so much, and since we were the pastor's family who can sometimes feel isolated, we didn't have a chance to form any lasting friendships. So we had to depend on each other. So when my brother was young, like 5, 6, even younger than that, I was the one who played with him and taught him things like how to throw a ball. And, it was good that he had a sister who was somewhat of a tomboy who didn't mind playing with the guns and didn't mind throwing the ball, and who didn't mind, playing football and doing the things that typically little boys do, playing with G.I. Joe and that sort of thing. So at one point, my brother said that I was the best brother anybody could ever have. We were very close like that. But that was when he was little. And that's when I fit into the mold that my family had designed for me. But as my brother grew up and as I got older and came to live full into my own awareness of who I am, my brother realized my sexual orientation, and that began to change things between us. Whereas before we were really close, we ended up descending into a point that we didn't even speak. If we spoke, it was very tense, or even it was hostile. And so for years, we stayed away from each other. That seemed like the best way to keep the aggression at bay. So we just ignored one another. But of course, my mother used to pray that my brother and I would reconcile. She used to always say, before I die, I want to see all my children loving each other and getting along. And we tried to explain to her, we'll be there for each other, but we just don't need to talk to one another. We don't need to be together. We're just fine staying in our own corner. But one day, I was at a friend of mine's house, just hanging out one day, and my cell phone rang out of nowhere. And I answered it. And to my surprise, it was my brother on the phone. And he was at a men's retreat at his church. And I couldn't believe what he was saying on the phone, but my brother called me to apologize. He apologized for how he had treated me. He apologized for the things he had said to me. He just apologized for the problems that we had been experiencing between us. And at first, I couldn't believe it. But then I realized that was really hard for him to actually make that phone call. That moment reminded me of that story. I don't know if you ever watch any of the Christmas shows, but I remember, I think it's Santa Claus is Coming to Town or something like that, where the winter warlock has a change of heart and his icy heart begins to melt and ice falls off of him. That's what that moment reminded me of for my brother and for myself, that the ice that had formed around us started melting off and falling off during that time. And that process had to take place for my brother to be able to call. And on my end, it had to take place for me to release the anger and the hurt that I had been feeling, to release it enough that I would be able to hear what he was saying. Now, it's taken some time for things to thaw completely, because apologizing and forgiving are really difficult processes. There are some moments when the strain would return, but the apologies and forgiveness actually work over time, but they take time. There were moments when, after saying, I'm sorry, where we don't feel sorry, where We feel, I'm sorry, but I'm really not sorry. I'm sorry for what happened, but I really don't like you. I'm sorry, but I really don't get you. I'm sorry, but you really should be different. We live in a nation in a time when we would do well to remember the energy of forgiveness, like what happened between my brother and me. There needs to be a time where we have some real lasting forgiveness and reconciliation that's born out of the awareness of our common humanity. We can't get stuck in a cycle of sorry, not sorry. We've been there before. We've heard apologies for slavery, even on an institutional level. Sorry. Yet systemic racism still exists. Not sorry. We've been in a year-long battle of differing opinions while living under an umbrella of a deadly virus. There's a line drawn between Republicans and Democrats that now has become venomous, like barbed wire between us. But someone or each of us must be willing to hear and if necessary, actually apologize to that family member or that coworker that we've labeled as the enemy. Because, even those of us who think we're loving and accepting individuals, we all have some they in our life. There's some they that we demonize. I think it was Dale Carnegie who said, when we hate our enemies, we are giving them power over us, power over our sleep, our appetites, our blood pressure, our health, and our happiness. Our enemies would dance with joy if only they knew how they were worrying us, lacerating us, and even getting even with us. Our hate is not hurting them at all, but our hate is turning our days and our nights into a hellish turmoil. What we need for a hopeful and peaceful future is mutual forgiveness. Not sorry, not sorry, but real healing. That road, though, is not always easy. The scripture for today reminds us of that. The text comes out of the Gospel according to Luke. There's no definitive understanding of who the author's true identity was, but it's the same author who wrote the book of Acts. The author gives us the detailed account of Jesus's life in Luke, but then he tells about the beginning of the church in Acts. And it's thought that this author is the same author that wrote in about the 2nd century. That Luke was a physician, which may be why the Gospel of Luke is more descriptive when it comes to illness and afflictions and healings. In the case of the passage for today, Luke gives an explicit account of the execution of Jesus. Some of us are familiar with that story. Jesus had been going around living out that love-based politics of compassion, as Marcus Borg calls it, in a culture whose norm was the fear-based politics of purity. The growing popularity of Jesus' countercultural message, though, in addition to the impact that it was having or threatening to have over the power and the financial bottom line of the religious and Roman leadership, that got to a point where it meant Jesus had to go. And within a span of a few days, Jesus was betrayed by someone in his inner circle, denied by one who supposedly loved him, arrested and tried like a criminal, and those who had followed and celebrated him the week before chose a criminal to be spared from crucifixion instead of him. And then to add to it, he was mocked on the way to and while he was on the cross. Crucifixion was the most horrific form of execution in Jesus's day. The Gospels do not give enough information to say exactly what form of execution Jesus endured. I read where Seneca described the possibilities. He said some crucifixions had the person upside down, and some were impaled through their personal area, and others were stretched out on crosses the way Christians have depicted for years. No matter how Jesus was executed, it was gruesome. But after all that suffering and abuse, Luke records that Jesus manages to say, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." That's more than most of us can even imagine. We would have been cursing them. We'd have been worse than Seeley. We would be looking at them and saying, "Until you do right by me," or trying to get somebody on the ground to agree to avenge us. We would have been nowhere near forgiveness. But I'm not totally convinced that Jesus was fully able to forgive those who turned on him. Notice that the text says, "Father, forgive them," not "I forgive you." Because forgiveness is on some levels of abuse is just too difficult to fully forgive. But I think the fact that Jesus asked God to forgive was the best he could do to forgive under the circumstances. He didn't want to have anger and hatred be what he was feeling as he transitioned from this life to the next. The situation was bad, but unforgiveness was worse. Forgiveness is letting go of the need for revenge and releasing negative thoughts of bitterness and resentment. I recently read a book by Desmond Tutu called The Book of Forgiving, where he speaks of the injustices and atrocities experienced in apartheid South Africa. Unimaginable rape, mutilation, torture, and murder occurred, along with other forms of disrespect and abuse that accompanies government-sanctioned discrimination. It was feared that the transition to democracy would become a bloodbath of revenge and retaliation in South Africa. But they chose another future. They chose to forgive. They chose to embrace humanity of all people. Although our troubles and abuses may not be on such an atrocious scale as apartheid in South Africa, there are some things that we can gain from Desmond Tutu when it comes to healing a nation, a community, a family, or even a relationship. Whenever we face an issue that brings us harm or loss, we all reach a crossroad. When we get to the point of our pain, we can choose what he refers to as either the revenge cycle or the fourfold path of forgiveness. There's no real good that comes out of the revenge cycle. It always feels like you're running on a wheel that never stops. Tutu describes the revenge cycle as going from pain to choosing harm, to rejecting shared humanity, to revenge, retaliation, and payback, to violence and cruelty, and then back to pain. The revenge cycle doesn't bring about any kind of positive closure for anybody. That's why it's so hard to hear people who embrace the death sentence. What does that gain? How does that bring closure to anybody? It's a cycle of revenge. It's not a cycle of healing. Have you ever had an interaction with someone who just went off on you or came out of left field with some attack that you felt had nothing to do with you at all? I recall a couple of times when church members or coworkers came at me with undeserved or unjustified anger. I've seen it numerous times when counseling couples or coaching couples, when one person in the couple jumped from one bad relationship into a new one and never had time to resolve or process what had happened in the last relationship. So they brought along a suitcase full of anger, distrust, or some other toxic issue. And these are the things that can happen when our hurts, our harms, our losses, and our pain sends us on the path of revenge. But there is another path. When we get to the point of our pain, instead of choosing harm, we can choose to heal. We can choose to forgive. Sometimes we don't forgive because we see it as weak or naive. We see it as devaluing our sense of self. But I think that comes from a misunderstanding of what forgiveness is. Forgiveness does not mean that we were not hurt, or that the pain is gone, or that things are back as they were, or that we excuse what the other person has done, or that we will forget what happened. Forgiveness means You want to be free of the pressures of unforgiveness. You want to break out of that cycle of wanting somebody to pay or to admit what they may never admit. It means you want to be free. Max Lucado said, forgiveness is unlocking the door to set someone free and realizing you were the prisoner. But how do we move from the prison of unforgiveness to a place of forgiveness and freedom? That's not an easy task, but Desmond Tutu offers what he refers to as the fourfold path of forgiveness. He says we have to tell the story, we have to name the hurt, we have to grant forgiveness, and then we have to renew or release the relationship. Because when we tell the story, we get our dignity back. I'm not referring going from one person to the next and telling the same old victim story over and over again. That doesn't help us or anybody else. But by looking at the facts and being honest about what happened, we may find in our memories, we may see a chance to evolve. It's important that we tell the truth, not what we think will get us sympathy. Telling the story gives us an opportunity to hear it ourselves in the presence of people we trust and people who have our best interest at heart. That's why it's important to have one or two friends who love you and who will be honest with you. I can't tell you how many times my friends Billy and LaShonda listened to me and challenged me as I told stories of hurt and disappointment. Eventually, you might even be able to tell the story to the person who harmed you, but not with any expectation of hearing an apology. And if you can't, or if it's not safe to talk to the person who harmed you, write a letter and either send it or don't send it. Even if the person's no longer alive, writing the letter might be a good way to release what we've been feeling. I started writing a memoir earlier this year, but I scrapped it when I realized that much of what I had written was an expression of pain that I had accumulated over the years, things that I thought I had forgiven, but writing helped me to see in some cases my fault in what had happened. And it also helped me to connect to the humanity of my perceived perpetrators in new ways. Sometimes when you tell your story, the narrative starts to change. The next step on Tutu's forgiveness path is naming the hurt, because we're only fooling ourselves if we never admit our own pains. It will show, it will come out in some kind of way. Tutu said, when we ignore the pain, it grows bigger and bigger. And like an abscess that's never drained, eventually it will rupture. And when that happens, it can reach every area of our lives, our health, our families, our jobs, our friendships, our faith, and even our very ability to feel joy may be diminished by the fallout from resentments, anger, and hurt that are never named. I remember years ago, I had a clerk that reported to me when I was at AT&T, and she was the most obstinate person I had ever met. We sat right next to each other, but if I had work I needed her to do, she told me not to speak to her. She didn't want to call her. She didn't want me to turn around and talk to her. She wanted me to just take what I needed done and put it in her in basket, and she would get it done when she got to it. You know, after about a year of this, it was just getting to be too much. I was just about ready to say, it's time for you to go. As a matter of fact, we had a review and she told me, you know, when you think about me, you have to think about a 2-year-old because that's how I act and that's who I am. And I turned to her and I said, well, that's why 2-year-olds don't have jobs. But we got through that time and she took a break. She took a week off from work. I don't know. I didn't know where she was going, didn't know what happened, but she came back and apologized. She apologized for everything that had gone wrong for the year before. And I asked her what happened. She said, well, she didn't realize that she had been angry all that time. She was angry because she had to move from California to Georgia in order to keep her job, which meant she had to leave everybody behind, including her, as we say, her boo. And It wasn't until her boo moved to Atlanta that she realized that was the problem. And she came back to work as a completely different person. And that's what happened when we're angry and we don't name what's going on with us, when we don't take some time to stop and see what's causing me to be such an angry person, what's causing me to be such a difficult person. It's important that we name our hurts so they don't drive us into acting in unhelpful and unkind ways. You know, I was reminded while I was preparing this, I was reminded of Anita Baker, I Apologize, that song, where she says, I know I was wrong. You know, she knew that in that song, she knew that she was blaming somebody or hurting somebody for something that was something going on inside of her. That's how we live sometimes. And we need to be mindful of naming the hurt so that the hurt doesn't drive our life. And third, we must be willing to grant forgiveness. This was true of my relationship with my brother. I had to actually listen to him. I had to hear what he was saying and choose to forgive. But the tricky part of forgiving is that we don't always speak the same language of apology. In their book, The Five Languages of Apology, Gary Chapman and Jennifer Thomas highlight 5 different ways we relate our apologies. First, some of us express regret. We say, I'm sorry. Some of us, for some of us, an apology means accepting responsibility, saying I was wrong. For some of us, it's making restitution. We need to hear, what can I do to make this right? For some of us, it's genuinely repenting. Someone saying, I'll try not to do that again. And for others, it's requesting forgiveness. For us to hear an apology, we have to hear someone say, will you please forgive me? We need to try to learn to tune our ears to hear an apology in the way that it was meant to be expressed. That's why even though my brother apologized to me many years ago, I'm the type of person, if you apologize, just saying I'm sorry is not enough. I have to see a change. You need to show me something different for me to believe your apology was true. So even though my brother apologized many years ago, I didn't fully feel comfortable with him until last year, when he graciously welcomed me and my family to his home for a barbecue. And we genuinely had a good time. Someone once said, right actions in the future are the best apologies for bad actions in the past. My brother and I had to remember that we were just 2 people trying to care for and love our families, that we were fully human, and that we were full loving human beings. Finally, Desmond Tutu suggests that we find ways to renew or to release relationships. Oddly enough, some relationships can grow stronger even after an offense. That's because through the healing process, you find ways to be vulnerable and speak your truth to one another. It may not be easy, but if we're able, we can release those emotions that we've been avoiding, which have been blocking the depth of love, concern, and trust that a healthy relationship affords. In some cases, even former enemies can become friends when we're able to speak our truth to one another. Don't be afraid to ask for what you need. It may be an apology, an explanation, or some tangible object, or you may need never to see that person again in life. But either way, we have to look at and accept our role in what happened. Sometimes release of a relationship is the most healthy move. But if there's still an attachment to the anger, we have some individual work to do so that we're not in some prison of anger and hurt and unforgiveness for the rest of our lives. The preferable thing, however, is to be able to renew the relationship. But this is what was needed between my brother and me. And that's what's needed with us as a community, a country, and a world. On a national level, we need to recognize our shared humanity. We need to look at the people who are angry and fearful and sad about the election results. And then we have to remember that Some of us were there in 2016. Some of us in 2016 were also angry, fearful, and sad. I'm not saying we all responded the same, but what I'm saying is we have to remember that everyone experiences hurt. Everyone experiences fear. Everyone experiences trouble. But we all have an opportunity still to reconcile once we see the humanity, the full humanity of our brothers and sisters. Those of us who embrace love and peace need to find ways to coexist. I'm glad today because we have positive examples of forgiveness. We have it from Jesus. We have it from South Africa. We have it from our own history and even our own relationships. Forgiveness may not be an easy process, but it's necessary for our survival. I remember it was Mahatma Gandhi who said, "An eye for an eye just leaves everybody blind." I hope for the existence of our society that we break this cycle of sorry, not sorry, and move forward to real forgiveness and real reconciliation. We do that by acknowledging the full humanity, full rights, and full equality for all people. It was Martin Luther King Jr. who said, "Forgiveness is not an occasional act, it is a constant attitude." Let's end sorry, not sorry, and let's really forgive one another and learn how to love. Thank you for listening.